Concern trolling, or as it used to be called before the internet, the do-nothings, is an essential toolbox in political agitation and discourse control. It has been around since times immemorial and has been adapted on every political system or political situation. Since the 16th century, this toolbox was understood as a standard subset of propaganda. Prior to that, it was just a tool of doing politics. However, since the 20th century, the method got refined in ways that would have been unthinkable in the 16th century, and these days concern trolling is an integral part of any political force that takes itself seriously enough. So, what is concern trolling and how to counteract it? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, it's been a while since I haven't made a video on practical politics, but that's in part because I was busy doing practical politics. And also it's been a while since I made a video in this format. Yeah, maybe I should do more. So, concern trolling. That's a tool that's been around for a long time. Over the last decade, the non-left was very busy deploying it, even when a lot of our people weren't fully aware that that's exactly what we were doing. All of that worked pretty well, all things considered. But not understanding the tool itself has the disadvantage of not recognizing it when deployed against you. So, Chapter 1, what is concern trolling? Put simply, concern trolling is when someone agrees or pretends to agree in full or in part to a certain point of view, but then his actions and positions ultimately end up undermining effective action in favor of that point of view. The term concern trolling is routinely used in context of deliberate action against a goal, but that's a very narrow view. A lot more often, concern trolling is not a deliberate action in the sense of pursuing a goal, but rather the professing of a relatively honest belief, routinely as a result of ignorance. And in contemporary times, the overlap between intentional action of undermining and candid ignorance is even higher, thanks to algorithmic enshittification, social media brain rot, and generalized encouragement of a calling out culture. That's how we got to the situation where genuine concern is misinterpreted and/or mislabeled as concern trolling. Sometimes this is deliberate for the purpose of enforcing groupthink or some type of discipline, but more often than not, this happens because, more often than in the past, the ability to spot nuance and the virtue of saying, "I don't know," have been lost, or they've lost their importance, or have been, their importance has been downplayed, let's put it this way. And one of the reasons this happens is because of a specific subcategory of concern trolling practice, which is commonly known as astroturfing, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the most common reason concern trolling occurs without malicious intent is ignorance. In the world of activism, ignorance is in fact shockingly common. Some of it is even understandable, albeit inexcusable. A lot of topics have become excessively complex, while the demand and expectation of hierarchy has also gone down. And all in a climate where the experts themselves aren't really experts. It's the perfect storm for creating even more concern trolls, really. That's why the tactic of creation of doubt is so effective. It has always been quite effective, but the success ratio improved significantly in the last decade. Chapter 2. What is a concern troll, or types of concern trolling? Now this is simple. Concern trolls are usually one of these three. They're either part of an astroturfing effort, these ones are almost always malicious. They're do-nothings in the Alinsky tradition, these ones can be either malicious or honest. And 3, ignorance, and these ones are almost always honest. Astroturfing is an essential part of concern trolling for the purposes of activism. And it's not a new one either. I'll get to examples soon, but astroturfing is simply the logical step, especially in an era of mass democracy, even though, again, astroturfing doesn't require democracy necessarily. Do-nothings, as defined by Solinsky, are the most dangerous ones from an activist perspective, regardless of whether they're malicious or honest. Why? Well, because more often than not, do-nothings are usually people who command some level of trust in the community or communities that the activist wants to influence. In the words of Solinsky, quote, "Just as the clash of interests within the have a little and want more has bred so many of the great leaders, it has also spawned a particular breed stalemated by cross-interests into inaction. These do-nothings profess a commitment to social change for ideals of justice, equality, and opportunity, and then abstain from and discourage all effective action for change. They are known by their brand. I agree with your ends, but not with your means. They function as blankets whenever possible, smothering sparks of dissension that promise to flare up into the fire of actions. These do-nothings appear publicly as good men, humanitarian, concerned with justice and dignity. In practice, they are invidious. They are the ones Edmund Burke referred to when he said acidly, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, unquote. Now, the hard part in this context is to separate legitimate concern, ignorance, and do-nothings. And an effective activist reserves some resources towards this goal as well. One of the reasons leftist activism has gotten less effective in the past 5 years or even 10 years is precisely because they stopped doing that. Up until 2020, at the very least, serious leftist activists did spend some time and resources into figuring out whether someone is an asset, an enemy, or a hindrance to their definition of progress without actually being an enemy. And by the way, a similar process needs to be internalized on the right. The decentralized nature of the right has made the necessity of such a process less stringent, but as the right regains power and is more often placed in positions to govern, such process becomes a lot more important. Otherwise, you end up in power governing alongside do-nothings. Chapter 3. Examples. Now again, while the concept of concern trolling is almost always used in online context, the practice does predate the existence of the internet by several centuries. And just like in the present, concern trolling was always kinda feminine coded. This is why women make the best concern trolls, by the way. My favorite example in history is Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France in the 16th century. She picked up concern trolling after the death of her husband and during her tenure as Queen Mother, that is to say, when the power was wielded by her sons rather than her or her husband. She was so successful in this that she's more known than her husband or her sons, and about half of the 16th century of France's history is called the Age of Catherine de' Medici. In fact, any successful concern troll should read a lot about Catherine de' Medici, who is, in my opinion, the founder of modern concern trolling. She was a Catholic regent in the middle of tensions between Catholics and French Protestants, or the Huguenots. In the 16th century, you see, that is the period that is called in France the Wars of Religion. Millions of people, including quite a few noblemen, died as a result of this conflict, which lasted for decades. Staying alive, even as part of the monarchy, wasn't for the feeble-minded. One way to stay alive was to pretend to be a moderate, which Catherine de' Medici turned into an art. For instance, during the negotiations leading to the Edict of Saint-Germain, she framed her actions as a reluctant compromise that would prevent further bloodshed, while in public statements she insisted she's a mediator that seeks peace for the stability of France and the welfare of both religious factions. Now, most of that was a lie, and an intentional one. 10 years later, when her favorite faction, the Catholics, had the upper hand, she had no problem instigating what is now known in historiography as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which was the worst of the century's religious massacres, which is quite a feat in a century rife with religious massacres. The feigned empathy and moderation was merely a facade to gain time. In 1562, the kingdom could not afford to fight a civil war. But in 1572, a decade later, the kingdom was ready for it and believed they can win it. And by the way, they did. Now, 16th century examples aside, from the 19th century onwards, the world of politics is chock full of concern trolling, especially in the realm of economic policy that led to terrible outcomes. Like, for instance, many people are aware of Sweden's economic collapse in 1991, but very few are aware how that ended up happening. In the 1950s, two communists named Lars Gösta Rehn and Rudolf Alfred Meidner came up with something called the Rehn-Meidner model, which can best be described as a work of fiction starting from the premise that reality doesn't exist. Kind of like any communist work, really. Nevertheless, these men and the regressive anti-capitalist institution that funded them literally throughout their entire lives on Earth, that would be Landsorganisationen i Sverige, or the main labor institution, persisted in pushing it as a good idea for Sweden's industrialized and thriving economy. By mid-1970s, the political vehicle of this scheme, namely the Social Democrats, had enough power to at least try to enact the reform. But they continued to fail because, well, the idea of solidaristic wage policy, as they call it, was an impossibility. So instead, the mainstream left moved to a policy preference for job security. Now, the oil crisis of the 1970s also made it evident, even for the left, that such ideas can't exactly work in practice. Still, the idea of giving workers more money long-term and more control remained relatively popular. The Swedish Employers' Confederation came up with the idea of individual share ownership, that would be tax-free worker shares in their own companies. A voluntary scheme that would not scare capital, but encourage entrepreneurial initiative. Well, the problem for the left-wing government was precisely that. What do you mean more entrepreneurs? We can't have that. The left instead argued that individual shares will divide workers. Some will get rich, while others will get nothing. So they demanded collective funds to protect equality. Despite warnings that this will lead to capital flight and a higher fiscal burden with no benefits, well, the policy was enacted and that's exactly what ended up happening. In 1983, the Wage Earner Funds Act created 5 state-controlled funds owning about 7% of the stock market by 1990, all of it financed by profit taxes. The funds were essentially a version of socialist sovereign funds, except they were controlled by the unions and funded again by a profit tax. By 1991, this led to several big Swedish companies going listed abroad, and the capital flight so severe that led even high-ranking lefties voting for the right wing to come in and save them. The proposal by the Swedish Employers' Confederation could have made the majority of workers capitalists, but instead, the country got a statist dead end and an economic crisis as a direct result of constant concern trolling about equality. Oh no. Now, of course, not all instances of concern trolling are successful, and sometimes the apparent objective is actually not the objective at all. Do you remember how we're all gonna stop doing videos if the United States repeals net neutrality? I do, because I made a video at the time in which I said net neutrality is stupid and getting rid of such nonsensical rules is a very good policy. I got a lot of flack for it, including from some right-wingers, but 8 years later, you can recognize that I was right, even if you do so privately. In reality, net neutrality was a grandiose concern trolling campaign. You can figure that one out easily when noticing who supported that campaign. MoveOn.org, which is the Democrat Party's main NGO, Color of Change, the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Tumblr, Greenpeace, and of course the always wrong Last Week Tonight host John Oliver, who presented 2 full-length Last Week Tonight segments about the issue. All of these people were wrong. Most of them had no idea that they were part of a concern trolling campaign, and they didn't care anyway. But there were a few fans of the regulation who were fully aware of what they were doing, such as the Electronic Frontier Foundation, whose donations went way up the more people believe that the sky is falling if the regulation is repealed. Over time, however, my predictions turned out correct. The solution to throttling is more and better infrastructure and thus higher speeds, and not state regulation. Also, as long as the infrastructure is private, it's really weird. You can't exactly claim that everyone has a right to freeload on someone else's infrastructure. I mean, you can if you're a communist, I guess. But the fast-paced nature of the news cycle, alongside the professionalization of mostly left-wing activist class, doesn't allow anyone anymore for a stop-and-think moment. The last 30 years are rife with concern trolling to a far larger degree than in the past. Remember how all computers were supposed to experience mass dysfunction in January 2000? That was a large concern troll campaign to justify some good old-fashioned money laundering. Before that, all computer systems were supposed to have a huge problem on September the 9th, 1999, because it overlaps with the code for an unknown date. Of course, that was false too. Oh, and don't get me started with every single climate prediction in the last 50 years, nearly all of those being either a smokescreen to launder some cash or intentional disinformation from Russia or China for ulterior economic reasons. Like, have you been to Siberia recently? And by Siberia, I mean Great Britain. The total geniuses and government experts at the Pentagon told us in 2004 that Britain will be Siberian by 2024. I became aware of this cretinous nonsense in 2007 when an otherwise highly respected professor told me this in all seriousness and was baffled when I simply laughed in his face. He, like many others who can't get enough of trusting the experts, couldn't fathom that someone could simply laugh off at the Pentagon expert consensus. Oh, and I went to New York City in 2018 to see the city for one last time, because the experts had told me back in 1989 that the West Side Highway will be underwater by 2019. Now, I have it on good authority that it's still not underwater in 2025, but that's probably because I'm a far-right bigot who doesn't trust the experts. It couldn't possibly be that the experts' so-called concern is the result of their own incentives to say nonsense that keeps the grants coming. No, it can't be that. No, it has to be my bigotry, obviously. No, seriously, I could go on like this for several hours, really. More than half of my job as a propagandist is to spot these things and prevent them from interfering with my goals or my customers' goals. And if you've been around the block for long enough, you will have lived to see a lot of concern trolling disproven. But unfortunately, having been around the block for long enough also means you've seen a lot of concern trolling succeeding and thus proving that most people are not stupid, but fucking stupid and thus easily fooled. Remember how plastic straws were choking the turtles? Well, that was fictional work as well. It was the fictional work of a 9-year-old. No, I'm serious. But then the 9-year-old's cynical mother published it as a serious study because she'd get money for it. Then those who saw the study cynically used it to get regulations that would favor their own otherwise failing business. A lot of money went to the pockets of shady businesses selling ecological straws, thanks to the gullibility of politicians, but also of the general public. It's money and power all the way down, either right from the get-go or somewhere down the line. Basically always. Yeah, sure, you can identify a few exceptions, but for the most part, it's money and power. Remember when all the bees were supposed to die and thus taking our civilization down? Well, the buzz, no pun intended, about that suddenly stopped after the Obama administration gave almost $100 million to the correct NGOs and institutions to solve the problem. Now, of course, the problem itself, to the extent that it was even real, was much smaller than claimed and was solved entirely by the beekeepers themselves, but that's not the point. The point is that those who started the panic got paid. That's it. That was the whole reason. So yeah, you get the point. Concern trolling is not something new. Chapter 4. How to recognize it and counteract it. Now, the recognizing part is mostly an exercise of knowledge and wisdom. Again, up to half of my work is doing just that. Recognize these things, cataloging them correctly, and then advising my clients to ignore them. Remember how the digital euro was supposed to not only become a thing, but also be mandatory by mid-October 2025? Yeah, that was fun. Those who trusted me had no problem. Those who trusted their favorite influencer, whether in favor or against the policy, ended up losing money and damaging quite a bit of their own mental health. Now, how did I recognize it correctly? Well, just look at the incentives. Who wants the digital euro? Well, the European Central Bank. That's it. There's no organic demand for it at all. Who opposes the digital euro? Well, almost everyone that matters, starting with most governments of Europe, basically any private bank not run by crazies, any citizen who understands how privacy works, and that's just to name the few. And that's the best tool to recognize when you're being concern trolled. Ask for the good old-fashioned question, cui bono? Because oftentimes the purpose of concern trolling is the same as panic porn, to waste your time and grind you down. Slowing you down is the most common effect if you take concern trolling seriously. Now, the second tool of recognizing it is to try to assess not just if the concern is legitimate, but whether it constitutes a serious enough concern to stop whatever you're doing in order to address it. For instance, are the crazies on the right a legitimate concern? Yes! See my video managing the CSET realignment from 3 years ago when I predicted this. But is this concern so important as to stop doing anything else and focus on it? No, not even by a long shot. Yet concern trolling over private chats has kept a lot of right-wingers busy last month. Why? Because there's plenty of interest in keeping the right busy with marginal nonsense. So, once again, cui bono? Well, the left, basically. Instead of discussing about the communist who might end up ruling New York City or the unironic Nazi who might be part of the US Senate, large segments of the right were kept busy with discussions about what some 20-year-old may or may not have said in a private chat. From there on, various grifters and other co-interested parties ramped up the concern trolling to keep the discussion going. The purpose is not to find a solution or reach some new consensus. No. The purpose is to keep you busy and forget about the actual totalitarians in the Democrat Party. It also helped that a lot of figures on the right did take the bait, either by defending the private chat or joining the Karen chorus about how this is not how we are. In both cases, you did exactly what those who devised the campaign were hoping to achieve. The correct response would have been, of course, who the hell cares? Yeah, whatever, some youngsters said something nasty in private. Now let's get back to this Muslim communist about to run New York City, the violent psychopath that runs for the Attorney General in Virginia, and the unironic Nazi who runs for Senate in Maine. Now, I may end up publishing this after the election, so if the violent psychopath actually wins in Virginia, then congratulations, Republicans! You just made everything far worse because you were busy trying to address manufactured concern from the least legitimate people in human existence. Hopefully you take the lesson from this and don't fumble it in Maine next year. Ultimately, concern trolling is a form of DARVO, which is a manipulation technique often found in people with a narcissistic personality disorder. DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim and Offender. You see, it's not like the Democrats are choke full of violent psychopaths, communists, Islamists and other totalitarian vermin. Here, take a look. Some random said something in a private chat, so it's really all the same. See how this works? So the first lesson in how to counteract it is to learn to say no and refuse such lopsided thinking. The goals of counteracting concern trolling should be twofold: to avoid wasting resources on an agenda-driven, routinely false or exaggerated concern, and to preserve the mental health of your allies. Much of politics really does rely on how persistent can your best activists remain. And their persistence is intimately tied with mental health. The left is slowly finding this out the hard way, while the right still has the opportunity to avoid ending up in the same position, the one where they find out the hard way. This is why smarter leftists are doing their best to prop up efforts meant to demoralize you. And concern trolling is one of the tools in the toolbox. And it's far more effective against the right than it was against the left. Why? Because while right-wingers are a lot less susceptible to shame and self-doubt if they're portrayed as lacking status by left-wing standards, the right is a lot more susceptible to self-doubt when it's portrayed as hypocritical, regardless of whether that portrayal is true or not. And if you've been around long enough, you know this to be true. Lots of classical liberals, libertarians, normie conservatives, and other segments of the non-left have tried to portray left-wing hypocrisy in an attempt to either shame or start a dialogue, and for the most part that did not work. But the reverse is very likely to work, and the record of history is pretty clear on this. So, the second lesson, therefore, in counteracting is to reject the notion that all arguments are created equal. It's why I keep on trying to tell people in every private class that the real world of politics is not the Oxford Debate Society, with a referee that at least tries to be impartial and with a highly intellectual public that votes on pre-established rules of debate. No. The real world of politics is routinely the Oxford Debate Society, where the referee is openly hostile to you, the rules of debate only apply to you, and the voting public is random and routinely votes on feelings and isn't even aware that rules of debate even exist in the first place. As such, the non-left ends up harming itself by yielding to concern trolling. The correct approach is to assess who says something and why, not just what is being said. Thou shalt not do ad hominem is a very fine intellectual rule among men of honor. But it's a bad idea when you're not dealing with men of honor. So when a communist calls me a fascist, I don't rush to explain why I'm not a fascist. I just call his mother a fascist, his daughter a whore, and then move on. You don't have to engage bad faith people. This is both for those who try to be influencers and for those reading or listening to too much or too many, I should say, bad faith arguments or reporting. The third lesson in counteracting concern trolling is leveraging knowledge and wisdom. This is of no use for the general public, but it's highly useful for the activist. The more you know about the topic at hand, the less likely you are to fall for concern trolling. And the more you know about the topic, the better suited you are to also teach your allies on how to avoid the same trap. Chapter 5. Some conclusion, I'd say. Ultimately, figuring out concern trolling is just as much of an art as it is a skill that comes with experience. Dismissing too much concern leads to becoming detached and in a bubble. This is what the left has been doing for the last decade. Any criticism was deemed concern trolling, no matter how innocuous or legitimate. Meanwhile, the right has been excessively open to taking any concern seriously, no matter how fringe or bad faith. For a while, this was advantageous to the right because it wanted numbers. But for the rest of this decade and into the 2030s, this excessive openness will necessarily have to be tempered with good old-fashioned conservatism. The day has 24 hours for all of us. That's the only equality that exists out there. Resources are finite, so no, not all concerns are created equal, and not even all legitimate concerns are equally legitimate or worthy of equal attention. Basically, apply to external concerns the same rules that apply to economic policy. That's the best first step to weeding out concern trolling, regardless of whether it's coming from an astroturfed op or from a genuine ignorant. In economic policy, we always make the argument that we can't have infinite state expenditure and that trade-offs are real. Well, the same is true for how you and your allies manage your own mental health and your most important resource, which is not the money, but your time. So yeah. That will be enough for now. I probably need to say more, but that would mean taking some concern trolling seriously. So maybe next time. Thanks a lot for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you really like this kind of thing, do consider becoming a member. Slowly but surely, the pile of exclusive videos on members.freedomalternative.com is increasing, and a lot of those will never be public. And with all of that being said, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative. Cheers!